Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So, this week we are talking about daddy issues. So, thank God it's not me this week. We already talked about my dad. I'm done. So, we're going to talk about just something so common to so many people, daddy issues. I guess we'll talk about mommy issues another time.
Well, so we were sitting around Easter, and virtually everybody who was there had daddy issues.
How many people don't? I mean, it's crazy, right?
So fathers are very important to your development. They're very important to your self-esteem. I once heard it said, you just sort of expect that your mother will love you. So the real test is whether or not your dad does, on how you end up feeling about yourself. And the same is true for, whether you're a boy or a girl, a man or a woman. Your primary relationship with your father really does matter. And we spent a whole week talking about your dad. And some people were probably wondering about my dad, who's a character, to say the least. He's the embodiment of the American dream.
Right. He's
Grew
tough,
up
though.
From very poor immigrant
Right.
parents. Grew up in Flint, Michigan. I'm glad he's not there now because of the water crisis that was there. But they were very poor. Although when you're poor, he said he never knew he was poor,
right?
Because he was like everybody else in the neighborhood. He had a very high work ethic. He actually went to work when he was 12 years old. In a grocery store, also delivered papers.
Isn't that interesting? My mom's also, my grandparents were Lebanese immigrants. And so my mom grew up very poor, and same thing, that same work ethic. So, just very interesting.
Huge. Yeah. And then he met my mom when I guess he was 20, she was 18. They were married in 2 months or something like that. And he went to work. And when he wasn't working, he was having 7 children. And so I asked my mom, I said, didn't you know how that happened?
She wanted all of you guys, though. That's huge. She said she wanted a whole bunch of playmates.
And
she got them.
She was a great mom.
She's still a great mom.
She's
still a great mother-in-law.
And as much as I love my dad, and he's going to be 90 soon, he's, one of my best friends, besides you, but he didn't get an A for being a dad. He was gone. And when he wasn't gone, he was just sort of not that nice, is what I remembered. And critical. I remember telling him I wanted to be a psychiatrist, and he asked me why I didn't want to be a real doctor. And when I was 18, Vietnam was still going on, and I had a very low draft number. And I said, I think I'm going to join. And he said, oh, you can't do that.
Right.
And so, of course, I then did it because I wasn't that smart. And so I know what it's like to have daddy issues, as many of the people who are here.
So let's give them a question to start with, and then something practical to do at the end. So the question that came to my mind, maybe you can say what's on your mind, is how do you see the way that your relationship was with your father? How do you see that it has affected your life? So however it is that you visualize it, how do you believe it has affected your life? And how would you rather it be?
Is that a question for me?
No, it's for the audience.
Okay. Well, let me answer it. Well, maybe not, because I think it helped me. I work really hard. And I don't see that as a down thing. I've always seen it as a positive thing because I'm doing something purposeful. But it's like, well, I'm not going to be like my dad, who never went to a baseball game or a basketball game or anything like that. So I was way more present, but more lenient with my children than perhaps I should have been, looking back on that.
Because you wanted to be the opposite.
Because I was reacting against how he was. And sometimes people go
Extremes.
Too far.
Like I did with my mom.
With that. So you want to ask yourself, what impact did your relationship with your father have on you?
Okay, so I like that. And my relationship with my dad, the way I saw it, I didn't believe that it was going to affect my relationships going forward because I was too young to really understand. So I cut my dad off hard when I was 18. Didn't talk to him again for many, many years. And not knowing how that was going to affect my relationships. And so my vision of men was sort of unknowingly affected by that. My connections, my ability to connect and commit. So just like I walked away from my dad, it became easy for me to then, if something's not going right or I believe that something's headed the wrong direction, bye-bye. It's just,
Yeah, that
there's the door.
explains the first 18 months of our relationship.
But when I healed that relationship with my dad, when I got therapy for that, when I healed it, I went, oh, like I used to think it was just a bunch of psychobabble nonsense. Like, oh, your relationship with your dad affects
That primary relationship probably had nothing to do with the person you became.
Right.
So,
But it was true, it did.
Reflecting on it and then asking yourself, was it helpful? Did it serve you? Was it in your best interest? You know, along with that is also birth order issues, because that really plays into your relationship with your father. So you're an only child.
Well, I had two
which
half sisters,
is,
but they're 10 years younger.
right. But that's a very special place to be. So the special parts of a family is you're the oldest girl or the oldest boy, and the youngest. And when you're one of seven and you're third, you're sort of screwed if you have an older brother and a
Who's in
sister.
the middle, right.
Yeah. And so wanting attention. But what's interesting about middle children that a lot of people don't know is that most of the revolutionaries
That's so
in the
interesting.
world, people who can push against authority, they're not only or oldest children. They tend to be middle children.
That's so
because
interesting.
they're pushing against the status quo as a way to get meaning and independence and so on. So I will hold on to that for me. But
See,
I think birth order
struggling.
matters.
I remember struggling for attention, trying to get attention because I was alone a lot. I mean, like, not kidding, alone a lot. I was a latchkey kid with a single working mother who, worked 3 jobs. So I was alone a lot. So always trying to get attention and trying to achieve and trying to be good and trying to get straight A's and trying to do the good girl thing to get attention. And when it didn't work, so to speak, my mom adored me, but she was just busy. When it didn't work, I just remember okay, fine, bye, I'm going to do my own thing. And just sort of disconnecting from all of it.
Another interesting part of daddy issues is how old was your dad when they had you? Because
See, that's what I was going to say about your dad. Your parents were both very young, and your dad was working hard to make something of himself and feed his family. So that had to affect how he interacted with you guys.
Yes, no, he's a great grandfather. And I would tell my children just like,
that's like my mom too.
I'm like, this is not who he really
That's
is.
how my mom too. When I had my
It's like,
daughter,
don't believe this.
Right?
But in fact, you should believe it, because as he got settled,
Right.
as he became
more successful,
he had more time to reflect on what was really important in his life.
Well, and he was able to act
was
on
I
it.
different at 25, I was still in medical school, than I was, for Chloe, for example.
I'm glad. See, people.
Yes.
So there are times I wish I had had Chloe when I was younger because of the energy, right? Being able to be a young mom and being kind of crazy. But then I look at my mom who had me very young, and I'm actually glad overall that I didn't have Chloe too young. It's one of the reasons that I value health so much, why I work so hard. It's staying healthy because I'm an older mom. I had her when I was 35. So because of that, it's important to me to stay healthy. But me at 25 versus me at 35, yeah, no, I wouldn't have been a good mother at 25. I mean, maybe I would have. Maybe I would have made me change.
You would have been a great mother because you have a very good soul.
Yeah, but I wasn't ready. And I knew I wasn't ready.
We would love for you to write down the one thing you learned from this podcast and share it on whatever your social media platform is, #BrainWarriorsWay. And also at brainwarriorswaypodcast.com, feel free to leave a question, and Tana and I will get to as many as we can.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back. This is Daddy Issues Week, and I told you a little bit about mine. In this podcast, we want you to ask yourself, how did my dad's mental health, brain health impact my life? I think that would be a good question for them to begin to ponder.
Yeah.
And you have some reviews you want to read.
Just one short one. This is by Chen Shang. It's from my YouTube channel. You are touching my soul and spirit. Thank you. So we post the podcast on a few places and they can access it and then pick it up. So
how did your father's mental health, brain health affect your life?
No, this is really interesting. And I think that it's important for us to sort of touch on this because, same dad, but there's me and my two half sisters, and it affected us in extremely different ways. So I think it's because we had different mothers as well. So I think it can be different. But if you talk to my sisters, the impact that my dad and his erratic behavior had on them was significantly worse.
Well, they lived with him.
Right.
And you didn't. You only visited periodically. So dose exposure.
Very true.
So how much exposure you got. So
but I had a
your
very
dad
strong mother
might
too.
be schizophrenic, but if he raised you day in and day out, that left a much more intense, lasting negative imprint, perhaps, than if he wasn't in the picture at all or only periodically. So dose response is really, that really does matter.
So let's talk about some of the issues that the people we deal with and talk to, some of those issues that...
Well, as a psychiatrist for 40 years, this has been one of the major themes in my practice, is not only how'd you get along with your mom, but how'd you get on with your dad?
Mm-hmm.
And
isn't this really important for girls and how they go into relationships with men?
It is, but it's also really important for boys about how they actually feel about themselves.
Okay.
That if you can never please your father, often other people can't please you.
Oh, interesting.
Because you have this pain inside. And we have talked about Eckhart Tolle's concept of the pain body, the sum of all the unresolved hurts you have that can get triggered at a moment's notice without anybody doing anything but looking at you a funny way because they had gas. You can often be triggered for no clear, rational reason because internally you have a lot of unresolved pain. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, when I was a young medical student, someone I loved tried to kill herself. That's why I became a psychiatrist. And, when I sent her to see a really great psychiatrist, we came to find out, and she denied this for a long time, is that she grew up in a severely abusive alcoholic home.
Isn't it weird how you deny things?
She had such shame and felt so disloyal saying that he was an alcoholic, even though the definition of an alcoholic. So if you ever wonder if you're an alcoholic, it's your drinking gets you into trouble and then you do it again. It's like you don't learn that this behavior, in this case alcohol, is potentially toxic to your health, your work, your relationships, or your relationship with the law. And the police had been called multiple times, ended up getting divorced. There was a lot of drama and chaos around the relationship with her father. And so you know what it's like to have addiction around you.
Oh, yeah.
And the impact that has
But what
on children.
it's not true. My dad actually did have issues with substances.
But you
But I didn't grow up with him.
in your extended
Right.
family, the impact on children. And what happens is deep in your brain, there's a part of the brain called the limbic system. It's your emotional brain. And when you live in an unpredictable environment where there's moments of holy terror, right? Your dad beating your mom, or him beating you, or embarrassing you by the whole neighborhood knows that there's trouble in your house. Even though that may only happen 2% of the time, you never know when it's going to happen. And so it activates your emotional brain. And pretty soon you're always watching
Oh, yeah.
for bad things
That I totally get.
to happen. And it changes your brain. And unless you purposefully do something to change it back,
Yeah, but-
it can always be like that.
Yeah, but some of us don't want to.
Yes, I know you
Because we
want
don't
to.
trust that it. No, yeah, no. I mean, I don't live in a state of fear, but I live in a state of preparation.
But your emotional brain is chronically heightened.
Yeah, I'm
in
never
large
going
part
to stop that.
because of the craziness you grew up in.
Yeah, but I also was attacked on the street, and that had nothing to do with it. So there's just this idea
What do you
that
mean
it's
it
not
had nothing
safe.
to do with it? It took your already heightened
No, I mean,
emotional
it had nothing
brain
to do with my parents.
and it made it worse.
Right.
But see, we are a sum of all the things that have happened to us and how we reacted to all the things that happened to us. So getting back to the question, what's the impact, how was your dad's mental health, brain health, and how did that impact you?
I like that. And also, though, what about stepdads?
It's who's the primary male figure in your life. So your biological father was mostly gone, except for, a couple of weeks in the summer. But your stepdad was very important to you, even though perhaps he didn't get an A for being
He was crazy.
a stepdad.
But he ended up having a huge impact on me. Whether it was good or not is a whole nother question.
So stepdads are very important.
So the question is,
and so I have an adopted child, and his biological father was abusive.
Right.
Was
This is
ADD
what I
from
wanted to
hell.
ask.
Was his mother said she had to chain him, not literally, but to the chair at night so he'd do his homework, and the principal had been called, and was abusive to his wife. And when my adopted son was 9, he shot and killed himself. And given that Anthony, my son, who's now 42, hard to believe, was raised primarily by me,
Right.
he didn't have nearly the same level of trouble
Right.
that his
That was
biological
a big question
father
that I had.
did.
So in my case, I had a stepfather who was a little bit crazy. I mean, although he did have a big impact on my life. But for people whose fathers, maybe you have daddy issues because your dad is either absent, he's an alcoholic, he's abusive. But if you have a stepfather who's actually stable, consistent, and loving, I'm going to guess,
It
can
helps
make a big
to
difference.
ameliorate it.
Right.
And so what are some of the issues that can really cause trouble for a child if the dad has OCD? There's so much time spent around negative thoughts and rituals, that obsessions, compulsions, that it's chronically stressful for
How does
the
it
children.
present in
That's
the
why
children?
if you have a problem, you want to get it treated so that the stress doesn't roll downhill, if you will.
But how do these things present in people later? If your father was an alcoholic, if your father had OCD, if your father was severely depressed, what ends up happening to people later?
Well, sometimes they develop empathy and become therapists, or psychiatrists or psychologists, sometimes they feel damaged or defective because of what they grew up in, and their self-esteem really takes a negative hit. Sometimes they become superstitious. So if you have an OCD parent, it's like, well, if I do this, then bad things will happen,
So they pick
because
up a little
they
bit of
got
it.
that
Right.
modeling. There's also, if you have genetic vulnerability, well, you're more likely to struggle with some of those problems unless you get serious about brain health. So, yes, depression runs in families, but not always.
What about attachment?
It can significantly affect attachment because your primary attachments were unpredictable. And that may mean when you're in a really good relationship and everything's fine, you may actually unconsciously stir up trouble.
Or just not believe that maybe it's not your template of what is normal. Like when I met you, I kept thinking you were manipulative because I'm like, nobody's that nice.
I am manipulative.
So, well, everybody's manipulative. I meant in a negative way, but it's because if you grew
I
up in
repeat
chaos,
this all the time for my patients, which is we're all out for ourselves.
Right.
It's just the more sophisticated you are, the harder it is to tell. And I am naturally a very nice person,
You
but
are.
I'm really nice to you.
But if you
because
grew
I
up
love you.
in chaos, and this is one, so we started off, with a question, and we always end with a challenge, and this is probably going to be one of my challenges. If you grew up in chaos, you may not have a template set for what's normal and healthy and nice, right? Like I didn't. So that wasn't my template for how a relationship or a man is. I mean, my examples growing up were insane. So of what it should be like. So when someone was overly nice to me, see how even I phrased it, it felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to fall.
Always.
And so I actually had to consciously do therapy on that and like fix my picture in my head, which you can do. It's actually not that hard, but you have to be conscious about it.
So if you can
that's my
answer that
challenge.
question, how did your dad's mental health, brain health impact you? And well, what can you do about it? And you just said
Right.
in a very powerful way is you can change your template, and it doesn't just happen
wasn't that
overnight.
hard.
It doesn't
just
happen
takes
overnight,
time.
but it takes focus
Right.
on what do you want? Is this helpful? Is this healthy for you to do?
And it starts with awareness.
So please, link to this podcast, share it with your friends on Brain Warriors Way podcast.com.
And we want to
Leave
hear
a
your
question
comments.
for us. We'd love for you to write a review. We try to answer questions and read the reviews as we can. Stay with us.
I will embrace my many strengths.
I will not be tormented by my past.
I will find the right balance.
I will be calm and courageous.
I will be free. I am not just bipolar.
I am not just autism.
I'm not just depression.
I'm not just ADD.
I am not just anxiety.
I am not just OCD.
I am not just PTSD.
Welcome back to Daddy Issues Week. I hope this has been stimulating for you and not
Fun wouldn't be the word, but
and not
stimulating.
traumatic. But you have a review you want to read.
I do. This says life-changing information and entertaining by Eureka Kid. Eureka Kid. I stumbled onto this podcast after a head injury and learned more from these short stories than any doctor I saw in person. I love that. Great resource for anyone who wants to protect their brain or improve performance. And the Amen stories are really entertaining. I keep saying you married me for a never-ending source of stories. So
It's actually not true, but I like the stories as well.
you're always pulling them out of me. When I first met you, I wouldn't talk about anything. Do you remember that?
No, I'm a psychiatrist.
I know.
For whatever reason,
Which is
all
why I
I
didn't wanna
have to
date
do
you.
is just sit there. And
No.
people tell me their whole life
It's totally
story.
why I didn't want to date you. I'm like, he's going to psychoanalyze me. I don't want to do this. And then before I know it, you're like, oh, why don't you come on stage and share that? No. But you know what they say? Pain shared is pain divided.
So, daddy issues. In the last episode, we talked about the impact of your dad's mental health and emotional health on you. In this issue, I really want us to talk about how to change the template. And sometimes the template of what you remember is flat out wrong. And I've seen this with my patients over and over again. And I shared a little bit about my dad and how he was never there and he didn't go to any of my games. And I held on to that bitterness for a long time. And then there's the story when I was younger, we had a goat. Goat's name was Sugar, white, beautiful, fun, playful, who ate my dad's roses. And then one day, Sugar wasn't there anymore. Actually, Sugar got the death penalty for eating the roses. And we found out that maybe had sugar for dinner, which was just horrifying. And so I had held on to these bad memories.
I remember when I met you, you said my dad killed my goat and fed it to me. And I'm like, what? That's like Hannibal Lecter. Like,
yeah. So, some of my siblings don't remember it the same way, but that was very traumatic for me. And that sort of fit with him being irritable and not being around. But then he put all the home movies. There were a lot of home movies when we were little. And there were more home movies of him going to the park with us.
Right. He was there a lot.
And I had completely blocked that out because it didn't fit the story
You told yourself.
I was
Yeah.
telling myself
Yeah.
about my dad. And so I really had to sort of back up, reassess that memory is a tricky
Yes.
thing. And memory tends to be filtered by the story you're telling yourself.
So I have an example of this. So, and I want to say two things about this. One thing is, as children, your perception is your reality, but you can change your perception, right? But when you're children, your perceptions of the world is sometimes bigger and scarier than it is, which is why you have parents that protect you. And, it's why you need that. It's why when your parents are not there and you have attachment issues and whatever, you need your parents to protect you from this world that feels big and whatever. But I have a funny story about this. So when Chloe was about 6 and I was working on Love and Logic, and those were sort of my nightmare years with parenting. I was learning Love and Logic, and she got in the car after school and just was in one of her moods and throwing this fit and being very, very rude. And so, which at that phase she had a tendency to do, be very, very rude. So I used one of the Love and Logic strategies, and I probably didn't do it perfectly, but I was doing the best I could. And I pulled over and I said, sweetheart, I'm not going to drive and keep driving you around. I don't do that for people who I think are rude to me, right? So you've got choices. So, I'm not going to drive. So you can sit there until you want to be polite. You can step outside the car. We were like right next to a park. You can step outside the car till you're ready to be polite. Or you can deal with the consequences when we get home. I don't know what they are, but I'll tell you what they're going to be. And much to my surprise, which is typical of my daughter, always surprising me, she got out of the car, but rather than going to the park and like hanging out like I thought she would, she didn't. She took off. So she takes off down the street walking. And I thought, all right, let's see how far she goes with this. Because usually she doesn't like to be very far away from me. She's kind of an anxious kid. So she's walking, and I'm following her in my car. All right. When she gets down to the bottom where the busy street is, I roll my window and I'm like, that's enough. Now it's a safety issue. You can't go any further. So you can either get in the car and be polite or deal with the consequences when we get home. She got in the car. She was quiet. So her recollection of that story is so different. We were talking one day and she goes, yeah, I remember the time you left me. And I'm like, what time was this? I've never even left with a babysitter, let alone left you. What are you talking about? She's like, no, I remember. You left me. I walked by myself. And I was mind blown that she can't remember me following her. Mind blown. And I have
So
memories
it's her
like that as well.
interpretation
Right.
of what happened. Now, there's something very important I want you to think about. When you have children and they're at these ages, whether it's 2 or 7 or 14, unconsciously, you are going back in your childhood and reliving what was life like for you at that age. And a lot of parents, they have no idea this is going on. And if it was an age you got bullied, or an age you had body image issues, or an age you had public speaking problems, unconsciously, you're beginning to feel anxious and upset. And you actually have no idea why. And then you're becoming more reactive with your own children. And that dynamic becomes more problematic.
So the important thing that I learned about that thing that happened with Chloe was it made me stop and ponder how many details from my childhood were distorted because I was scared, because I was alone. How many of them got distorted? And so, they feel very real. They're my perception. They're my reality. And I even started fact checking some of the big things with my mom. She's like, yeah, no, that's accurate. No, that's accurate. But those little details in between matter. And if I was distorting those like Chloe did, right, then that means that I can change that perception. So you can always change your perception. But it just cracked that idea that it's set in stone, that that's what happened. So, I think that that's a really important thing to think about.
So here's the big aha that I found is that when I started looking at the brains of my patients, it began to dramatically change their perception of their parents. Mm-hmm. That when they went, oh, my dad was a Vietnam vet and he had PTSD and a traumatic brain injury. I wonder what his brain would have looked like, or would look like even now, to explain his erratic, difficult behavior. And I have seen so many tears happen when people realize it wasn't that he just didn't like me because I was inferior. It was because his brain had been hurt.
Yeah, no, I like that. Now, if you had a father who, let's say he didn't have a brain injury or something, let's say that he grew up in that environment. And so it wasn't because he was an alcoholic. It wasn't because he had a brain injury, but he grew up in the environment. It was modeled for him. What about someone who just kind of is a jerk? What do you do?
So this is the discussion my wife and I have virtually every day. And I would go back to...
Do not throw me under the bus.
I would go back to, how would you ever know unless you looked? Because one of the things...
My dad didn't have a bad brain, though.
Your dad did have a bad brain.
Well, he did. He had the because he was beginning to not remember stuff.
Right.
Didn't have
Your
a
dad
brain
was
injury.
diagnosed with Alzheimer's
Yeah, but that
disease
was
when we met him.
many years after
And he actually had pseudodementia, where his emotional brain worked way too hard.
But that's when I was
and
38.
If we go back in your dad's family,
depression.
Right? You are so hung up sometimes on he was bad when in fact
No.
he was sick. And if you look at his family history, he's loaded for depression and difficult behavior. Now, it doesn't excuse everything. And that's where you and I often fuss about things, right? What about responsibility?
Right.
What about free will? What about, you should have done better? And perhaps he should have, right?
Right. He didn't have a terrible brain.
his emotional brain worked way too hard, putting him at risk. Let me finish. Putting him at risk for depression.
Yeah.
When you're at risk for depression, you're at risk for negativity. You're at risk
Boy, did he have
for
that.
the world. The glass.
The sky is falling.
half
The sky
empty,
is falling.
which then puts you at risk for substance abuse or puts you at risk to actually flight into religion. You know, I'm like a huge fan of religion,
But he used it as a weapon almost.
Often used it as a weapon.
Yeah.
And the scans taught me that that behavior is complicated, and rather than judge people as, good or bad, when people's behavior's off, and his behavior was off, it's why. And if that's the one thing I take away from
I like the
imaging
curiosity.
work, it's rather than judge people as bad, to just go, I wonder why that happened.
No, I like that. I
And
like
then,
the curiosity.
as we've talked about forgiveness a lot.
Right.
And the scans have just been sort of a gateway for me.
I totally agree.
And when I scanned my dad, so, growing up, my dad's two favorite words were bullshit. That was number one. And number two was no. Anytime you asked
They
him a
still
question,
are.
the answer's no.
They're
it's
still
just
his
an
favorite
automatic
words.
response.
He's hilarious.
And
though.
so when I asked him to be scanned as part of my normal group, because he's normal, he's actually, highly successful, he said no. For like 12 years, he said no. And when he finally said yes, because I think my mother withheld sex from him or something, he finally said...
That was too much information, really.
He finally said yes. My mother's like, why don't you help your son? What's the matter with you? His cingulate was overactive. It's the most overactive cingulate I'd ever seen in someone who was 72.
Funny.
And people have an overactive cingulate, worried,
They're
rigid,
stuck.
inflexible, things don't go their way, they get upset. And their favorite word is no. No
Right.
way, never.
But I have to say, your dad is actually also one of my favorite people. He's hilarious. Like he's actually hilarious.
He is. He's awesome. I love him. All right. So if this has been helpful for you, please write down that one idea that you got from the podcast that maybe behavior is more complicated than you know.
And my challenge is ask yourself, is it possible that your memory, that there's a crack in it? Is it possible that it's not exactly how you remember it? Is it possible that because you were a child and the world seemed big and scary, that the details are distorted? You don't have to even answer what they were. Just, is it possible?
And we'd be grateful if you left a review, hopefully a great review, and you shared #BrainWarriorsWay on any of the social media platforms you're on. Thanks so much. Welcome back to Daddy Issues Week. And we thought we would spend the last podcast of this week talking about how to prevent daddy issues in your children.
So what is our question for today? Let's ask them a question that they can be thinking about and pondering.
So what's the one thing I can do to prevent daddy issues in my
To break the cycle. And
daughter
please
or
don't-
my son?
And please don't use the one that one of my daughter's friends used, which is, I'm going to give my dad daughter issues because I don't want daddy issues. Let's not do that. Okay.
So let me read this review. Everybody should hear this, by Brain Warrior Rachel. Love that. A fantastic podcast of bite-sized insights into the immensely important work of Dr. Daniel Amen and his wife Tana. I've been a student for about 20 years when I bought my first copy of Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, and it is still a hugely important reference tool for me today. Can't believe that 20 years later, psychiatrists are still not looking at the organ they are supposed to be treating. Dr. Amen's work should be part of the curriculum, not just for psychiatrists, but at all schools. Understanding how our brains work and its impact on our every thought, decision, and action, it is life-changing. Thank you both for continuing to share this hugely valuable information.
That's awesome. So, I have something to say really quick about that. So I worked for Medtronic. I'm a neurosurgical ICU nurse, trauma nurse, and then I worked for Medtronic for a while, which was part of why we had such a great first date. We were talking about the brain so much. One of my therapies when I worked for Medtronic was deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease and also for depression. Okay, so here's my question. It makes no sense that if we know, what we would do is go into the operating room, the patient's awake, has to be awake, and they're putting this little probe down into the brain, and the reason the patient's awake is because they have to find the right spot. So someone with a massive tremor who can't be still, if you get the right spot, all of a sudden, they're completely still and they can write their name, okay? Same thing with depression. You hit the right spot, the depression goes away. Now, if that is true, and something like that affects, if you're touching the brain in certain places and it affects a person's life that much, then how on earth can you say that you shouldn't be looking at the brain to figure out what's going on?
Well, it's the whole concept behind the end of mental illness is these are not mental illnesses, they're brain illnesses.
But do you see what I'm saying? It's obvious.
Yeah, for like 30 years, I see what you're saying.
But to me, it was just like so clear.
Yeah, no, it's insane.
Because I dealt with it in the operating room.
Look at the brain. But the question for this podcast is how do you prevent daddy issues in your child? And I'm going to give you the answer that has worked for me. Not that, you have to talk to my kids on whether or not they have daddy issues.
Everybody's got some sort of daddy issue.
But it's being a good listener. It's not over speaking them, not, they say something and you just talk too much. It's learning about active listening that we've talked about over and over again. And it's time. It's actual physical time. And so when I was a child psychiatry fellow, so I'm learning to be a child psychiatrist, so I realized nobody really listened to me at home. And as great as my mom was, there were 7 of us. So my most special times, maybe once a week or once every other week, I would read to her for 20 minutes. And that was gold for me. And it's why I loved my grandfather so much, because I actually got that alone time with him. And it's a problem in our society because we have 2-parent working families. Now, I don't want anybody to feel guilty about it. It's what you need to, 90% of mothers in California work outside the home because it's expensive to live here. It doesn't need to be a lot of time, but it needs to be consistent time. If you can find 20 minutes, 10 minutes a day to just be with your child, do something they want to do, no commands, no questions, no directions, just be in their space and listen to them, that's going to go a long way to preventing mommy issues or daddy issues. So really critically important for parents. I have this one story. So Carl, he was my first entertainment attorney a long time ago, like 30 years ago. He had a daughter when he was older. And he's like, she never wants to spend any time with me. And I'm like, it's because you're ignoring her. And he said, what do you mean I'm ignoring her? I'm like, you're ignoring her. Don't lie about it.
Well, and don't lawyers have a tendency to put their family on the stand when they get home? They just have this tendency to, you have to be careful not to do that with kids.
And he said, that's a girl thing, right? Girls want their moms. I'm like, no, girls want their daddies too. And so I basically said, do this, 20 minutes a day. And she was like, 2. Sit on the floor and play with her. And don't do anything else. Don't look at your phone. Don't respond. Don't do anything else. Just be with her. And he's like, oh, it's not going to work. I'm like, oh, great. You represent an idiot. I'm telling you what to do. And so he's, all right, I'll do it. And he did it. And 3 weeks later, he calls me up. she won't leave me alone. As soon as I walk in the door, all she wants to do is be with me.
Yeah, because
And
if you start to go
it's
in,
time
right.
and a willingness to listen. Just be in their space. Don't use so many words. And that's actually why children listen to their dads more than their moms, because
mine.
moms talk too much.
Not my child. My child listens to me, but I think it's because I'm bonded to her. So I think the bonding really goes a long way. So I want to touch on one thing. I love what you said about bonding, though, because I think it's hugely important. You know how you always say that you can make your child a Republican, a Democrat, or anything you want? So
It's by the relationship.
right. It's the relationship. It's the bonding. But I want to touch on something because we're talking about how you can break the cycle. And I started out by talking about working with Medtronic, seeing how, doing certain things to the brain affected the brain, which means that if you have brain issues, it's going to affect how you're behaving. It's going to affect whether you have depression. So I think one of the things that's really important to start with is make sure that your brain is healthy. Make sure you are optimizing yourself, that you're your best self as a parent. I know it really helped me to see that. And because I really have this belief, it's just a strong belief of mine, that you have a choice, but you only have that choice, that free will, if you're coming from a place of having all your tools, of having your hardware work right. So if you start from a place of having a healthy brain, even just go online and take our brain health assessment. It'll really give you an idea of where you're at. That's free. Just go to amenclinics.com. Start there.
Go to brainhealthassessment.com. You can find it from amenclinics.com, but it's complicated.
Okay.
So brainhealthassessment.com, you'll say which of the 16 brain types you have and also how healthy or not your brain might be.
So it's a good place to start because once you balance your brain, you get your brain optimized, right, from where you are, it increases your choices. It increases your choice to do better, your ability to take responsibility. So I really think that's a place to start.
So brain health for the parents, brain health for the child, because sometimes people have daddy issues and your dad was fine. You were the problem.
Right.
And I love the quote, insanity is hereditary. You get it from your children.
Right.
And those of you that have more than one, they come out different. That, my two girls, Brianne and Caitlin, Brianne came out more reserved,
Quiet,
a bit more anxious, quieter. She's an introvert, where Caitlin came out waving at you.
Taking off across the parking lot.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. And Haven,
oh my God. Oh, she's
who's
so
now
cute.
10 months old, is so cute. But she's just very much like Caitlin, and she's waving.
Right.
And was wiggly when she was young. So they come out differently. And often it's the fit between the parent's temperament and the child's temperament that determines the relationship. Yeah. So optimize your brain, optimize your child's brain, spend as much time as you can on bonding, time and a willingness to listen, and your child is less likely to have daddy issues.
I love that. So we started off with a question, and let's end with, we told them what they could do. So if you wouldn't mind posting something you learned, we would love to hear it. We love to read our testimonials. We love to read things that you tell us. So post what you've learned, post something you're doing, anything, any comment from the podcast, and also use hashtag #BrainWarriorsWay on any social media site and share this if you've enjoyed it.
So the question, just to review, is what are the things you can do to prevent daddy issues in your child? Again, hashtag #BrainWarriorsWay. Leave a review. Thanks so much.
If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're interested in coming to Amen Clinics, use the code PODCAST10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com. For more information, give us a call at 855 978 1363.